Viridian, the Green Guide by My Head in the Clouds Not Coming Down, a Boku no Hero Academia fanfic. Chapter 44 Burn. Izuku was used to heat. He got burned by Kachan's quirk often enough that burns were about as common for him as stubbed toes or scraped knees for other kids. But still, Izuku couldn't ever remember more heat in his life than there was at the moment that Endeavor's attack hit the alcohol on the ground and the entire room practically exploded. Izuku desperately shoved himself away from the berserker and sprinted as hard as he could to get away. But even with all his practice outrunning heroes these past few months, he still wasn't fast enough. He screamed more in fear than pain as the flames finally caught up on the alcohol that had soaked in his clothes during the fight. This had been what he was hoping for, wasn't it? He was finally going to die. His mother wouldn't have to deal with having a quirkless kid. Kachan wouldn't have to deal with Izuku following him around. Eraserhead wouldn't have to worry about him getting too involved in dangerous cases. Kaminari wouldn't have to pretend to be his friend. This is exactly what he had been trying to do, right? The thoughts raced through his head within a fraction of a second, going through every emotion possible, until they finally landed on determination. No, he wasn't going to let this be the end. Izuku might have been nothing but a quirkless weakling, but he still had things to live for. He still had to tell Eraserhead what he had learned about All for One. He still had to teach Kaminari Park over. He still had to finish his classes, so his mom's love and acceptance wouldn't go to waste. He still had to watch Kachan become the best hero. Izuku wasn't willing to die yet. Izuku hadn't been to that many birthday parties in his life. He had only been 4 when the kids at his school stopped talking to him, and he obviously didn't remember anything from the birthdays he had as a baby. There was a vague memory, however, from one of Kachan's birthday parties that Auntie Mistuki had insisted he be invited to when they were 6. Uncle Masaru had lit the candles, and then Auntie Mistuki had amazed them all by running her fingers straight through the flames. She laughed when they asked if it had something to do with her quirk, before explaining that as long as she was fast enough, she wouldn't get burned. Of course, Kachan had immediately tried it, and ended up exploding the whole cake when the flames ignited the nitroglycerin on his palms. But it had been fun while it lasted, which meant that this was now a race. Could Izuku put out the flames before they built enough heat to kill him? He immediately dropped to the ground, covering his face, and started rolling to smother the flames. He spread a trail of flames as the alcohol on the ground ignited, but the alcohol burned away quickly, like the time the science teacher had poured hand sanitizer on the desk and burned it away without even scorching the desk. Soon enough, Izuku had rolled to an area where either less alcohol had been spilled, or it had burned away, and he managed to put out the flames. Izuku winced when he got up on his feet. He felt like he had gotten a really bad sunburn, and he definitely rolled in some of the broken glass. But he'd survived. For now, he still had to get out of the building. The berserker was down for the count from Endeavor's attack, but the remaining civilians, thankfully only a handful, were screaming as the flames burned tables, chairs, and everything else in sight. Okay, he could deal with his pain later. Right now, he just had to get the civilians out of here. Fire extinguisher, maybe in the back? Izuku searched as best he could, grateful that his goggles were somehow still intact and protecting his eyes from the smoke. As soon as he saw a fire extinguisher hanging on the wall, Izuku ripped it off its hooks and sprinted towards a section of the wall that looked particularly fire damaged. If there isn't an available exit, Izuku grunted as he adjusted his grip and staggered slightly under the weight, then I'll just have to make my own. He swung the fire extinguisher as hard as he could, and the wall crumbled into ash as he crashed into it. Izuku continued bludgeoning the wall as hard as he could until the hole was hopefully large enough for people to crawl through, praying to every deity he knew that the fire extinguisher didn't work too much differently than the movies. Izuku took a few steps back and pulled the pin, and started spraying the base of the remaining flames in the exit he had just made. There was a little kickback as the foam started shooting out, but Izuku held his ground and kept working until he cleared a path outside. Come on, this way! Izuku threw the fire extinguisher to the side as he ran to the nearest group of civilians and grabbed a woman who seemed to be having more trouble than most with the heat, probably because she had some type of quirk that made her look like a frog, just like the man she was with. How did that affect diet? Wait, no, bad Izuku. Fire now, cool quirks later. He dragged the woman along with him until they got out into the cool air, and he handed her off to her date so he could run back inside and help the last of the civilians out, only to stop in his tracks when he saw Endeavor and Amplifier leaving the building with a final group of stragglers. Amplifier used her quirk to yell at the paramedics and the firefighters who were just arriving. "Evacuate the area! The building's about to come down!" Izuku considered running back inside anyway, but then he jumped a foot in the air as a loud crash echoed over the streets and the roof of the bar collapsed under its own weight, making him extremely grateful that he had gotten out of there when he had. Wait, what if there were people still inside? He forced himself to take a deep breath in a poor attempt to stop the guilt and self-doubt that was rapidly trying to choke him. He had gotten the heroes and had done all he could, so now he could only hope that it had been enough and take care of his own injuries. "What were you thinking?" Amplifier yelled at Endeavor, though she was apparently trying to keep her quirk from carrying her voice because there was still civilians around, in addition to the reporters and other media personnel that were just starting to arrive. "That attack was too risky. Were you trying to kill Viridian too?" The expression of contempt on Endeavor's face made Izuku freeze in terror. Unlike most of the heroes that Izuku had come across, Endeavor would probably treat him the same as he would a villain, and considering that Izuku couldn't see the berserker anywhere, well, Izuku didn't want to think about what could have happened right now. "Why should I care what happened to an attention-seeking hooligan like that? From my perspective, I saw two villains fighting and took care of it, just like I was supposed to do as a hero." Endeavor huffed and glared coolly down his nose at Amplifier. "It's not my fault that you don't seem bothered to do your job, and instead let vigilantes run around unchecked." Okay, he was definitely not letting Endeavor see him again tonight. The heroes knew how to do rescue operations better than he did anyways, and Eraser and some of the others should be on their way. So he'll just have to trust them to save everyone they could. Decision made, Izuku hissed in pain and ducked into an alley to take stock of all the damage he had taken as the adrenaline gradually started to ebb away. His dreams were more ripped than they had been at the beginning of the night and were singed slightly in places, but they were probably still salvageable. Same with his tool belt. He had lost his pipes, and he had obviously given away his knife, so all he had left was a handful of marbles and a slingshot. So he had to replace most of that. Hopefully at a time that Kaminari wasn't working, so he didn't have to avoid the awkward questions about what he was building with all this stuff. His hoodie was practically totaled though. It was made of a different material than his jeans were, and obviously hadn't handled the heat nearly as well. Parts of it had melted or burned away completely, and the parts that were still hanging on had been completely turned to ribbons by the thorns and glass. Izuku winced as he took it off and threw it into a nearby dumpster. Right now, it just called more attention to him than he really wanted, and it wasn't like his DNA was in any law enforcement database. So, even in the unlikely event that someone found what was left of his hoodie, they still wouldn't be able to use it to find him. Plus, he already felt like he was burning up, so he didn't need the extra layer to keep him warm. Now, onto his body. Izuku grimaced as he looked at his arms. He looked like he lost a battle with a rose bush. There were dozens of scratches and bruises layered underneath the burns, and just from craning his neck to see as much of him as he could, Izuku could tell his chest, back, and legs were in similar states. There were also pieces of broken glass that dug into his skin, which obviously wasn't great. Overall, Izuku knew he'd probably had worse injuries at some point, but he was having a hard time remembering when. This was, it was pretty bad. For about half a second, Izuku considered just hiding his tool belt somewhere and pretending to be a civilian, so he could go to the paramedics and say that he was another victim of the attack. But he threw that idea out almost immediately. His disguise isn't that great, and there was a chance that Amplifier or one of the other heroes would be able to recognize him immediately, even without his goggles on. They might not say anything, but Izuku didn't want to put anyone in that situation, especially not with Endeavor breathing down their necks. And even if he wasn't worried about his identity, he was obviously underage. He didn't have a single legal reason to be in that bar, and if he went to the paramedics, they'd call his mom, and he'd have to explain that he'd left after she went to bed, and she would be so worried and disappointed and, well, he'd just have to come up with another option. Normally, Izuku would just go home and take care of the injuries himself, but if there was as much glass in his back as there was in his arms, then it would take forever to remove it on his own. It would be a lot better if he had someone to help, at least with that part. Then he could bandage the cuts up himself. But Izuku was a quirkless loser. He didn't have any friends. Oh, he had never actually been to Kaminari's house before. He'd given Izuku the address because he had said that it seemed like something that friends should know. But Izuku wasn't about to bother Kaminari by showing up or asking to come over. But the last time Izuku had shown up to one of their training sessions injured, Kaminari had said that he was willing to help him out. Hopefully that offer still applied at 3 a.m.
That vigilante is somewhere around here. Search the area!
Izuku heard Endeavor growl around the corner and forced himself to push off the wall and start moving. A few voices, probably his sidekicks or daylight heroes that Izuku hadn't met yet, responded affirmatively as Izuku stumbled off into the shadows and down the street. Thankfully, there was enough chaos on the streets that no one paid much attention to Izuku as he made his way to Kaminari's apartment. Normally, he would have just run over the rooftops, since it was faster and much less likely to get him spotted. But then again, he normally wouldn't be going over to his only friend's house to awkwardly ask him to take glass shards out of his back. So, Izuku figured he could give himself a pass this time. Sue him, he was tired, and didn't feel up to take the risk of falling asleep halfway between two buildings. He spent the walk hastily coming up with a cover story that would fall under the broad category of park over while still explaining all his different injuries, especially the burns and the glass. Thankfully, there weren't any thorns stuck in him that he could see, because that would have just added another unnecessarily complicated layer to his already convoluted lie. By the time he found the address Kaminari had sent to him, the last of his adrenaline had officially worn off, which meant that Izuku was practically ready to pass out from the pain and exhaustion that hit him like a brick wall. He let out a hiss that doubled as a wry chuckle. At least the pain was keeping him from falling asleep. Kaminari lived on the 3rd floor of an apartment building, and Izuku considered just knocking on the front door before looking down at himself and grimaced. Yeah, going inside the building wasn't going to go well, and Izuku didn't want to risk running into Kaminari's family looking like this if they opened the door instead of him. It shouldn't be that hard to figure out which window was his, right? It would be less weird and embarrassing than knocking at the door this late. Izuku peeked in the first window, which turned out to be a living room, then moved on to the next one, practically sighing in relief when he saw Kaminari lying on the bed, reading a book by the light of the electricity arcing between his fingers. Izuku hid the tool belt and goggles under the windowsill and knocked softly, hoping beyond hope that his cover story was good enough and that Kaminari didn't just turn him away. The minute Kaminari heard the knock, he yelped and dropped the book on his face. To his credit, he recovered pretty quickly, rubbing his nose as he looked frantically around the room for whatever made the noise. Come on, Kaminari, Izuku muttered as he knocked on the window again. Let me in. Kaminari turned to the window in shock and swallowed nervously before increasing the amount of electricity surrounding his hand, using it both to illuminate the room and defend himself from attacks. And Izuku couldn't hold back the small twinge of pride. A few months ago, Kaminari would have immediately surrounded his entire body in electricity, which would have put him close to his limit and at a distinct disadvantage. But now he was instinctively using his quirk that was both functional and defensive, all while keeping away from his limit. He was so smart. Kaminari reached the window. It took him about half a second to see Izuku. When he did, he yelped again and fell back onto his butt before scrabbling forward to open the window.
Midoriya? He whispered loudly. What are you doing here?
Well, Izuku winced. You know how you said I could come to you if I was ever injured doing parkover? Kaminari's eyes widened as he took in Izuku's various injuries, and the electricity in his hand started buzzing, as if reacting to his emotion.
What kind of parkover were you doing?
It's a funny story, actually. Izuku chuckled awkwardly, careful to keep a strained smile on his face. I really wanted to do parkover run tonight to see all the fireworks that everyone was setting off for New Year's, right? So, I did. But then, I guess I didn't look where I was going, and I accidentally ended up on the same roof as one of the fireworks as that went off. Kaminari winced sympathetically. Ouch. Is all that blood just from shrapnel and stuff? Izuku went to rub his arm nervously, only to stop with a nervous laugh as his hand caught a piece of the glass. Well, about that. Kaminari looked at him suspiciously. Midoriya, what did you do? Well, it was a really tall building, Izuku blurted out, and I might have jumped off the building to get away from the fire before finding a good place to land. There was a window, but, I guess it was dark and I didn't realize it was still closed.
You broke a window? Kaminari Whisper yelled. With your body?
Izuku chuckled nervously. Yes? The building was abandoned, so no one else got hurt. I can put the bandages on myself. I just need you to help with the glass. Unless you don't want to. You don't have to. And I probably shouldn't have come, but Mom doesn't know that I snuck out, and I can't tell her, and... Shut up, Izuku. Kaminari walked to the door and turned on the light. Can I call you Izuku? I feel like we should be on a first-name basis if I'm gonna pull broken glass out of your butt. Oh, Izuku blushed. He hadn't had any friends to call him by his first name since Kacchan had started calling him Doku. Sure, I mean, if you want, you don't have to, and... Cool. Kaminari apparently didn't care about his nervous ramblings because he walked straight out the door. Izuku awkwardly shuffled his weight back and forth as he wondered whether he should just leave. Maybe this was asking too much. Before Izuku had a chance to come to any kind of decision, Kaminari walked back into the room, carrying a tub of burned cream in one hand and some kind of zipper pouch in the other, all the while balancing half a dozen towels under his arm. He closed the door with his foot and turned to Izuku with a smile. And you can call me Denki, by the way. Oh, okay, sure. Izuku cleared his throat nervously. Of course Kaminari, Denki, had only left to grab first aid supplies. He obviously didn't keep him in his room like Izuku did, since he wasn't a vigilante or getting bullied at school. Izuku shoved down the guilt he felt over his stupid anxiety attack and focused on his more reasonable reasons to feel guilty. I'm sorry, I know I'm asking a lot of you, and I normally wouldn't do this, but it's whatever. Denki cut him off. It was more interesting than what I was doing anyway. Insomnia's a bitch. Izuku laughed. Yeah, I wish I couldn't agree from experience, but considering how late it is, mood? Denki snorted and started laying out the towels on the floor. Yeah, mood. I hope it's okay we do this on the floor. I don't want to end up with glass, well, anywhere if I can help it. Yeah, of course. Izuku took a towel and laid it beside the one that Kaminari had just set out. And, the blood too, probably. Sorry, I can wash these, if you don't want your parents asking weird questions. Denki shrugged. Honestly, that'd be great. Not that they would be really surprised. I think they're just too used to my weirdness. So, they just expect me to be, well, illogical rather than normal, but still. Do you want to start with your, well, your butt first? That way you can... Denki trailed off and started grabbing things from the first aid kit and setting them out on one of the towels as Izuku watched uncomfortably. Denki? Can what? What? Denki blinked and squinted at him. Oh, I'm sorry. I must have spaced. What was I talking about? Talking about taking the glass out of my, backside first? You seemed to be about to give a reason. Oh, that was so you could sit down or lie down while I do the rest of your body. Denki blushed and clenched his fist a few times.
really sorry about that. It's kind of late, and, my meds are kind of a morning and afternoon thing, you know? So by this time, so if I start rambling, or just kind of trail off if I get too focused on a task, that's why, I guess. I'm sorry. The meds just make the differences a lot more noticeable, you know? I know I'm really annoying, so I will try to stop. It's fine. Izuku waved his hands frantically in an attempt to reassure him. I ramble too, so it's not a problem. And like I said, I know I'm asking a lot, especially if it's this late and stuff. And I'm sorry. Nah, Denke smiled sadly and grabbed a pair of tweezers. It's not your fault my brain doesn't work as well as yours does, right? That doesn't hurt, did it? Izuku winced as Denke pulled out another piece of glass. It all hurts at this point. The pain is all blending together, so don't worry about it. Denke nodded and carefully yanked a piece of glass out of the back of Izuku's thigh. Are you sure you wouldn't just rather go to the hospital? No, they tell Mom and the heroes. If you just do the stuff I can't reach, I can do the rest when I get home. Denke rolled his eyes. Nope, you're already here, and you're not leaving until you're officially glass-free. No idea how you're gonna hide all this from your mom, though. Izuku picked a piece of glass from his arm and carefully set it with the others Denke had removed. That's a problem for tomorrow's Izuku.